cool. Not everyone benefits from watching them again, but again, I like the old saying of who is it? The old Mets coach. I think it was Yogi Berra, and he was once observing some players, and somebody asked him about it, and he said, "Yeah, sometimes you can see a lot just by watching. Sometimes it's amazing how much you can observe just by replaying a lecture that went by the first time." In the 90s, I coordinated what passed for distance learning in the 1990s, which was a situation where students got canned lectures. They taped them from public TV in the morning, and it was just a talking head. It was somebody giving a lecture. And I met with them in person and gave them review sessions. So I had to conduct these really concentrated review sessions 3 times a semester, and then I also made up their tests and graded them and what have you. So I had to really know those lectures back and forth, and I was also teaching at Hartford Community College at the time, and so I ran off some of the videotapes. I ran off the audio, and I was playing them in my car as I was driving up there in an old cassette recorder, and it helped. So you know, it's like if it helps you to review these, fine. It may or it may not, but try it. And of course, the thing about playing a Tegrity thing is you can play just part of one, you know, and say, well, okay, I followed most of that lecture, but he started to lose me, you know, towards the end. You know, I think I knew the first part pretty well, but I'm going to go back and replay the end of that lecture. I mean, you can do things like that with Tegrity. Again, you find the Tegrity recordings on the menu, have a little thing that says Tegrity classes. You click on that, they come up. And if you have any trouble getting one to start, try a different browser, try disabling the pop-up blocker. There, you know, are various ways. So, okay, Aristotle's virtue ethics. One of the reasons, not just because it's part of philosophy, ethics is part of philosophy, we saw when we looked at those pie charts, but one of the reasons why I like to cover some ethics in Intro to Philosophy is because a number of you are going to go into career paths where some later in your career, or maybe even in more specialized training, you may have to take a specialized ethics course. And you need to be exposed to philosophical ethical theories in secular ethics, because that's the way any ethics course you take. I taught business ethics for years, not here but elsewhere. That's a specialized ethics course. I remember one semester we had 17 students in the class, and all 17 of them were either accounting majors or working accountants who needed a specialized ethics course as part of what they needed to do for their CPA certification. But there are specialized ethics courses in medical ethics generally, in nursing ethics, even in cyber or computer ethics. So one of the reasons why I like to cover some ethics in intro is if you have an exposure to some of these theories in secular ethics, if you have to take a more specialized ethics course as part of your, say, nursing training or computer training or what have you, your learning curve, how hard it's going to be for you to orient yourself in that course, is not going to be nearly as steep as it would be if you're not exposed to these. So, now for Aristotle, there are actually two types of virtue. And when we're talking about virtue, this word has a wider meaning than just moral virtue. It's tied up with human excellence. What is it to live not only a good life morally, but an excellent life as a human being? And that's the kind of thing that Socrates and Plato were concerned with, but so was Aristotle. So one of the things that Aristotle did was he didn't just write in these obvious philosophic areas like the Nicomachean Ethics, which, you had that reading selection, which is what this is based on for the most part, these slides. He not only wrote in things like ethics and political philosophy, but he also wrote and was interested in topics in areas like botany and physics. Now, Aristotle's physics isn't going to look anything like the physics text you used in high school, but still he was interested in, and he thought we as human beings ought to be interested in the world around us and in learning more about it, So he thought there are intellectual virtues that people ought to pursue, and they deal with our theoretical knowledge. But he does talk about moral virtues in ways that, for his day, push the envelope on the concept of what a moral virtue is. And some of these virtues get discussed even in religious ethics. You will find the New Testament, while it calls them fruit of the Spirit, it discusses things like virtues like temperance, self-control, and things like that. But we're going to look at how Aristotle tried to push the envelope, and this is a view on the virtues that has withstood the test of time. It's not just of interest from a historical perspective, from a history of ideas perspective, but there are still people today who think that he came up with a characterization of moral virtue that is held up through the years. So it deals with and centers on what traits of character should a person who lives an excellent life, a morally virtuous person, what character traits should they have, and can they be developed? Or do people just automatically have them? Well, Aristotle tries to make a case for our not worrying about whether we have these virtues because we can develop them. And sometimes we have to develop them contrary to our natural inclinations and instincts. And you'll see what we mean by this later. So, this was why you saw the piano player in that video so much. Aristotle's argument is that we can acquire virtues and hone them over time by practice, just like we would acquire skill at, say, playing the lyre. Guitars and pianos weren't around in Aristotle's day, but ancient musical instruments like the lyre were. And think about it. How many of you play some kind of a musical instrument? Okay, not a lot of people. Maybe some people do. What kind of it? Piano. Okay, right. Well, you know that now I'm not a pianist. I always wanted to, but I never. But I played the guitar in a pretty developed way in a particular genre. But you know that it took you a long time to develop the kinds of skills that enable you to sit down at a piano and play something that somebody else is going to want to hear, right? You know that I can't, as somebody who does not play the piano, go over the library, check out a book on keyboards or learning keyboards, read it over the weekend, and then book myself at a local club as a piano player, in 2 or 3 weeks. It doesn't happen that way, right? So Aristotle thinks developing a virtue happens over time. We learn to build by building. My dad was a carpenter by trade most of, at least, the life that I knew. He was having problems trying to do painting, like house painting type painting, and his asthma was bothering him, and my mother convinced him to go to school on the GI Bill and learn carpentry as a trade, to retool himself, and he did. I have a knick-knack shelf in my living room that he built when he was in carpentry school. And so he learned skills, he learned to build by actually building some stuff there, right? My mother and father had a really good chest that one of my uncles made too. It's the same thing. So we learn to build by building, we learn to play an instrument over time by practicing, and he says we learn to become just persons by actually doing just actions. And for Aristotle, you don't learn to become more courageous by going off and meditating on just what courage is. You don't learn more self-control, say in the areas of food and drink, by going off and meditating on temperance or self-control. But he says, we develop these virtues not alone by ourselves, but in community, in our interaction with other human beings. This is one point that Larry Thomas was trying to make in that video. So we do not become morally just in isolation, but we do it by performing just actions in our transactions with other human beings. That is, we learn courage by actually making those decisions, by performing courageous actions. But what his argument is by doing this, we also develop a character trait, like, say, courage, and it becomes easier for us to act courageously, or we develop self-control in a certain area of our life, and after we've done so, it becomes easier for us to not go overboard in that area. So he thinks we can develop these character traits. Now, here's where Aristotle pushed the envelope in his day, right? The Greeks were talking about a golden mean. Plato and Socrates did talk about developing virtuous character traits. And for Plato, there are three parts to our psyche, or to the makeup of a human being. He calls them three elements of our soul. And there's the what he calls our lower nature that has to do with, he calls it the appetitive element, the element that has to do with satisfying our appetites for the kinds of things we need to satisfy to live, for food, drink, and even sexual fulfillment, stuff like that. So he says we also have a part of us that's, he calls it the spirited part of us, that has to do with our emotions and also with our drives, that motivate us to action. But then he says we also have a part of us called the rational part that should be ruling over, should be controlling the other parts. So Socrates and Plato talked about using reason to keep our, to not go to extremes in satisfying our basic appetites, or to keep our emotional life in control. But Aristotle gives us a model, an abstract model for a virtue that pushed the envelope, because, you might remember your school teachers talking about the mean, or what was the mean grade for the class, and you may have remembered in arithmetic, folks, again, please put your cell phones away. I ask you to do that. You learn maybe how to work it out. It's the midpoint. For Aristotle, virtuous behavior is moderate behavior. It achieves the mean. In other words, a virtue avoids extremes in both directions. It avoids taking things to excess. Now, it's pretty easy to see that, but for him, it also avoids taking things in the area of deprivation. Let me show you how this works out with particular virtues. An ascetic, and you see this a lot in some Eastern religions, is somebody who thinks that the right thing to do is just deny the needs of their body, even for basics. For Aristotle, that's not virtuous behavior. That's kind of denying your humanity. So asceticism for him is not a virtue. Now, it's easy for us to see that for somebody being an alcoholic or a glutton, that's not virtuous behavior. If somebody is grossly overweight because they're just addicted to food, or they're an alcoholic. But it's not so easy for us to see that things may be bad on the other side. So he says the right course of action, the moral course, is the middle ground. And courage, Aristotle talks especially about military type courage in those kinds of situations. And it's easy for us to see that cowardice is not a moral virtue, right? The person who is cowering in fear and won't go over the hill on the charge with the rest of people, or who runs for it. It's easy for us to see that So, a deprivation of courage, being overcome by fear, it's easy for us to see that as not being virtuous behavior. But for Aristotle, a person who doesn't feel any fear at all, just, like that, who was it? Andrew Jackson said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. We don't care. My dad was in World War II, but never talked about his World War II, experiences. And a lot of men who went through that were that way. But from seeing other World War II veterans being interviewed, they say, look, I may have been thought of as a hero, and I may have been decorated in this or that battle situation or gotten wounded, but most of these guys freely admit that they were scared going into the battles, but for Aristotle, that's not a bad thing. For him, courage is not a situation where you're not feeling any fear at all. My Greek professor talked about his World War II experiences, and he said he was leading a group of men in battle in Europe, and they had some new recruits come in, and one was an 18-year-old kid, very green, never been in combat before. And they get into a firefight. That's the euphemistic way of talking about a situation where people are pointing and shooting rifles and machine guns at one another, trying to kill one another. But it sounds a little better to call that a firefight. And the point is, the kid doesn't have a good appreciation for how good the enemy is. Starts standing up like he sees people do in the movies and shooting, and he gets himself shot. Well, I always thought that this was a good way of illustrating Aristotle's point that a total lack of courage on the other side is foolhardiness. But that courage isn't a lack of fear, but it's feeling fear but controlling it. I mentioned I run the Baltimore Backgammon Club. Part of learning how to play that game at a high level, since the whole game, the dice are a factor, and the whole game revolves around taking calculated risks. And part of learning to be a good player is learning when it's appropriate to do that. And very often, inexperienced players do some things that are just foolish and get them wiped out of the game easily because they don't know enough to know that, that's not a situation where they're justified in taking the kind of risks they take. Although more often, beginning players are on the other side. They don't want to take any calculated risks at all and wind up not being able to develop winning positions. But anyway, I don't want to get into that too much. But it's the same thing that, courage is in taking that calculated risk when it's the right thing to do, either in the game or even in a military situation. So again, for Aristotle, virtue of courage is the mean between extremes. So how do we achieve this? Well, very often we have to fight our natural tendencies we develop temperance in the areas of food and drink, in fighting our tendency to want an extra piece of cake or pie or whatever. I know these are trivial examples, but they are the kind of thing you think about. Or our nature is to be fearful, right? We know that the person in the carol, Mary in the carol, 3 people down, just got a raise, went in, asked the boss for one, got it, and you know that your numbers are better than Mary's numbers. Plus, you've been here for a longer time. And so, rationally, you say, I ought to go in and confront the boss about that and ask for a raise. Because if Mary deserves one, so do I. So by nature, you don't want to go in there. You're fearful about going in there and confronting the boss about a raise. But rationally, your reason tells you you should. There are times when rationally, I have to make a play that could lose a match. But I know that it's my best chance of winning overall. So the mean is achieved for him by using our reasoning abilities. Now, for Aristotle, there's a difference between the qualities that are essential to a thing and what he calls accidents, or just qualities a thing has but aren't essential to its being what it is. Now, there's a reason for going off on this tangent. So for him, very often, things are defined by their unique function or by things that they uniquely have. I mean, a trivial example is, look at the triangle I drew earlier on the blackboard. I could have drawn that with red ink, with a red marker or an orange one or a green one if I had it, right? But it would still have been a triangle because it's not essential to a triangle that it be any particular color at all, whether it be black or red or green, is irrelevant to its being a triangle, but it is essential to that figure being a triangle that they have 3 sides and 3 angles that add up to 180 degrees. So Aristotle talks about essential properties defining what a thing is. In other words, you're writing with a pen. You're not writing with a table knife or your cell phone, right? A pen's main function is to enable you to write on paper. The main function of something like this is to enable you to write on a whiteboard where a pen isn't going to do you much good. Take something like a knife. Its function is to cut. Now, there's a Greek word, arete, it's called arete. And that's a word for the excellence of a thing. Now, if we were fixing dinner and I had to cut through a chicken bone, and I said, look, hand me that knife over there in the knife block because it's a really virtuous knife. And I need a really virtuous knife here. You would look at me like I was from the moon. We don't talk about inanimate objects like knives being virtuous. Folks, I want you to put away the cell phones. The person on the back with the pink cell phone, take it up here and put it on the desk. You're not even listening to what I said. Class. So the point that Aristotle is trying to make is that arete is a word that describes a thing performing its essential function well, excellently. So he says, well, could that be the same for human beings? Could they have an essential nature, and so human excellence is involved with exercising what is unique to human beings? And his answer is yes. Now I want you to try and understand this and get through this. For Aristotle, the way we achieve human excellence is by exercising what is unique to us as human beings, which for him is our rational ability to understand concepts in language, to follow a proof, to reason with other people. He says that's what separates us out as human beings from all other living things on Earth. Plants only have biological functions. They don't even have awareness of their environment. They don't have an emotional life. They don't have what is called sentience. My cat has emotions and sentience and is aware of her environment. But for Aristotle, if you look at this chart, plants lose out on both sentience and rationality. Non-human animals, he says, are different in kind from human beings because, he says, only human beings uniquely possess these rational abilities. Now, after Darwin, it's become harder to make this point, right? Because Darwinian evolution sees reason, the difference between human reason and the reason of the higher primates or dolphins or something, as a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. But for philosophers like Aristotle, it's a difference in kind. And this persists even today. There are philosophers who take that point. So we achieve human excellence by using our reason to walk the middle ground, to walk the mean, to overcome our fear and become courageous, to overcome our desire toward gluttony, or to overcome toward our lack of desire towards something like bulimia. He thinks, for Aristotle, there is no separate world of the forms. He thinks forms exist. Plato had them in particular things, like in particular desks, but also in the intellectual world. That's what the world outside the cave symbolized. Whereas for Aristotle, forms only exist in things. For Plato, if all the desks in the world went out of existence, there still would be an eternal form, an eternal standard for what a desk is, the form of deskness. For Aristotle, if all the desks went out of existence, there wouldn't be any more form of deskness, because the only place that form can exist is in particular things. Now, the relevance of that here is that there is no form of the good to be pursued and known in the afterlife, like Socrates and Plato thought. For Aristotle, if virtue and living a virtuous life is going to have a payoff, it's not going to be in an afterlife, because he doesn't think there is one. It's going to be in this life, and he's convinced that we will live a happier, more satisfying life if we're virtuous, in the sense that we live a moderate life. So for him, happiness comes about, and he thinks it's the highest thing we desire. There are other things we might desire because they promote happiness, but he says happiness or eudaimonia is something that we desire for its own sake. So if we live in accordance with virtue, then virtue is its own reward, is the cliche. In other words, he says we'll live the happiest life, which turns out to be a life of moderation. Now, it's not what a lot of people are selling in the media, right? When I was your age, there was a song around saying, that people should, live to extremes and die young. And there was a whole history of famous rock singers dying at 27. For some reason, that seemed to be the magic age. But Aristotle's saying, no, the real happiest, most satisfying life is a life of moderation. And over the years, as an older guy, the people I know who are happiest with life are people who have their life in balance, and who are living that kind of life. Okay, make sure you sign the roll and give it back to me, and we'll see you Friday.